On a cool fall morning in October of 2000, 27-year-old Maureen Ryan was out for her daily jog. The air felt crisp in her lungs as she kept a brisk pace along the waters of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Until recently, she had been working as a rock climbing instructor out west, so as a result, Maureen was in great shape and very fit. She had always been athletic though, rowing crew and playing lacrosse and field hockey back during her high school days in Pittsburgh. But today, halfway through her very routine run, she suddenly felt woozy, and a surge of nausea crept up from her stomach. Maureen slowed to a walk and tried some rhythmic breathing to try to steady her heart rate. Unfortunately, it didn't help. She got dizzier and more lightheaded until it felt like the ground was tilting, and then suddenly it was rushing up at her. The next time she opened her eyes, Maureen was face down on the jogging path, her cheek pressed flat against the cold concrete. Her head absolutely throbbed. She rolled onto her side and began rubbing the bruise on her skull. Maureen felt lucky she hadn't knocked any teeth out when she fell, but at the same time, Maureen just could not understand how her body had just abruptly shut down like that. She had only fainted one other time in her life, and it was back in college after she had gone on an unusually fast treadmill run. Maureen assumed it was just a fluke because it never happened again. But now she wasn't so sure, because just the week before, during another run, she had felt at one point sort of hazy and actually stopped to rest, but that was obviously nothing compared to today, where she actually fell to the ground. And if this had happened while she was on stairs or something, she could have been seriously injured. And so suddenly, Maureen was terrified. It was like she couldn't trust her body anymore, despite having spent so many years working so hard to become strong and healthy and fit. It was like it didn't matter. Her body was going to do whatever it was going to do. Maureen picked herself up and carefully made her way home, and when she got there, she called her Aunt Eileen, who was a doctor in Pittsburgh. Eileen was a pathologist who ran lab tests on tissue, fluids, and organs in order to diagnose diseases, especially heart disease. But she was knowledgeable about most health issues, so Maureen really wanted her opinion on what had just happened to her. Eileen thought for a moment after Maureen told her about how she had just fainted during her run. Then Eileen told Maureen that she might be experiencing some type of irregular heartbeat. If left untreated, Maureen's aunt said that an irregular heartbeat could cause that lightheadedness and fainting that Maureen experienced. But realistically, that was the most mild of symptoms. This irregular heartbeat could lead to permanent damage to her heart, her brain, and other organs. It could even cause strokes, heart failure, and even death. And so Eileen urged Maureen to stop doing any serious exercise until she could meet with a doctor. Maureen appreciated her aunt's advice, but it was hard to accept. Being physically active and pushing her body to its limits made her feel energized, joyful, and alive. To stop exercising cold turkey would be a real challenge for her, but at the same time, she didn't want to risk fainting again, so she promised her aunt that she would take a break from running and would see a doctor as soon as possible. A few days later, Maureen lay on an examination table wearing a hospital gown. She flinched at the feeling of cold metal as the cardiologist stuck a series of electrodes to her chest. Even so, she was still glad to be there. She had not gone for a run since she talked to her aunt, and she was eager for this to be over with. Once the electrodes were in place, the doctor made sure the cables running to the EKG machine were untangled and connected properly. These would convert electrical signals from Maureen's heart into waves displayed on the EKG grid. By studying these lines, the cardiologist would be able to identify any irregularities in Maureen's heart's activity. Maureen closed her eyes and listened as the doctor flicked a switch. The machinery hummed into action, and soon Maureen could hear the beeps corresponding to her heartbeat. 5 minutes later, the test was over, and so Maureen opened up her eyes. The cardiologist quickly pulled up the results on a large computer monitor. His face was neutral as he scrolled through the data, occasionally stopping just to jot something down on a pad of paper. Finally, the doctor scooted his chair back, set down his pen, and turned to face Maureen. He told her he knew why she had been fainting. She had a condition called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. It's a congenital heart defect that makes the heart beat faster than it should, sometimes causing dizziness and fainting. Maureen was relieved to have a name now for what she'd been experiencing, but she was also shaken at the thought that there was something fundamentally wrong with her heart. The doctor could see how worried Maureen was, and so he told her the good news was that this condition was totally treatable using a procedure called a catheter ablation. It's a surgery where thin, flexible tubes are guided into areas of the heart suspected of causing the irregular heartbeat. Then, once it's in place, the surgeon permanently changes the electrical circuitry of the heart by creating scar tissue in these problem areas. Scar tissue does not conduct electricity, so once that's done, the irregular heartbeat disappears and the heart returns to normal. Maureen thought this procedure sounded really intense and pretty complicated, but she was at least happy to have, the next steps in place. So she thanked the cardiologist and said she would schedule this procedure as soon as possible. Back at home, Maureen called her doctor aunt with the news, and Eileen suggested that Maureen have the catheter ablation done in Pittsburgh where she was, so Eileen could look after her after the procedure was done. Maureen agreed, thanked her aunt, and hung up. Then Maureen went for a long walk along the bay, letting her mind wander. She hoped the sea breeze and the lapping waves might calm her nerves, but she was too distracted. All she could hear was the sound of her heartbeat in every footstep. 2 weeks later, Maureen stood outside a hospital in Pittsburgh with her aunt Eileen. Maureen had barely slept the night before, worrying about this catheter ablation, what could go wrong. But eventually, they went inside the hospital, and they went up to the receptionist desk, and they signed in. Once Maureen's name was called, she hugged her aunt goodbye, and she followed a nurse down the hall to get prepped for the operation. As Maureen settled onto a gurney, the nurse explained that the procedure would take about 3 to 6 hours, but Maureen would be sedated the entire time and wouldn't feel a thing and would just kind of wake up when it was done. Then the nurse had Maureen lie back, and she inserted an IV drip into her forearm. Seconds later, Maureen started to feel the warm and dreamy sensation as the sedatives hit, and soon her eyelids were too heavy to keep open, and she drifted off to sleep. Several hours later, as Maureen drifted back to consciousness, she stared up at the lights on the ceiling. It took her a minute to realize where she was, in a recovery room at the hospital, but once she understood where she was, she noticed her doctor was right there looking down at her. And once the doctor saw she was awake, he told her that the procedure was a total success. He said they had been able to find the section of Maureen's heart that was causing the irregularity, and they covered it with scar tissue. The doctor advised Maureen to schedule occasional follow-up EKG tests just to make sure her heartbeat remained steady, but otherwise, she was good to go. She could go back to her normal life. Maureen could not contain her smile. This was everything she had hoped for, and she could not wait to get back on her feet and go for a run. Two decades later, in October of 2022, Maureen sat on her bed shivering and dripping wet, holding a phone to her ear and wishing her Aunt Eileen was with her again. She had just made it back to her Seattle houseboat after fainting during that run in Lake Union Park. One moment she was jogging along happily, the next she was unconscious on the ground in the pouring rain, staring at a bunch of rabbits. It felt like her past heart issues were coming back to haunt her. But Maureen just couldn't understand how that would have happened. The catheter ablation operation she did back in 2000 was supposed to have fixed everything. And she had been exercising and living her life normally for years now without any major problems. But now here she was again, 2 decades later, nauseous and dizzy and passing out on the ground. After waiting a while on hold, Maureen was finally connected to a doctor who was inside of her healthcare plan. She told him about fainting in the park and summarized her fairly extensive medical history. The doctor told her to come in the next day for an EKG and also some blood tests. After she hung up, Maureen just sat there staring at the rain landing on the water. She thought she was done dealing with her body's mysteries, but clearly something else was wrong. The next morning, Maureen woke up early, still feeling rattled. She filled a thermos with coffee, put on a raincoat, and headed to her appointment. Once at the hospital, Maureen explained to the cardiologist how her career as a conservation biologist kept her extremely physically active. Even outside of her work, exercise was her favorite activity. In addition to jogging, Maureen skied, she swam, and went mountain biking. Occasionally, she would still experience a bit of dizziness or nausea, but it passed quickly. And every doctor she'd seen in the 22 years since her catheter ablation always told Maureen the same thing. Her vital signs were right where they should be. The cardiologist nodded and took some notes. Then he had Maureen lie back and arranged a series of electrodes on her chest for another EKG. Maureen took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and focused on the soothing hum of the machine as it measured her heartbeat. After a few minutes, the cardiologist pushed back his chair from the computer and came to Maureen's side and helped her sit up. Maureen braced herself for bad news from this test, but the cardiologist only shrugged, shook his head, and told Maureen that her results were normal. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. Maureen felt lost and frustrated. She knew the test had to be wrong because she was positive something wasn't right in her body. Last night in the park, she genuinely thought she was going to die. So how could this EKG test show nothing? It made no sense. The cardiologist told Maureen to call if she experienced the symptoms again, but until then, there really wasn't anything he or the hospital could do. Maureen thanked the doctor and appreciated what he was doing, but she knew now it was up to her to do some research of her own. Back at her houseboat, Maureen sat on the deck with a cup of coffee, a stack of books, and a printed copy of her test results. She had stopped by the library on the way home to check out a few books on heart conditions. Maureen's career as a conservation biologist had trained her to identify patterns in complex data, so studying EKG results did not seem overwhelming to her. The chart showed the electrical energy of her heartbeat on a graph. Each heartbeat looked like a spike as the blood is pushed out, with a little hiccup before and after it. She could see exactly how much electrical energy was being transmitted each time her heart beat, and exactly how long each beat lasted. After looking at these charts for a while, Maureen noticed an irregularity in her heartbeat that the doctor had not mentioned. The amount of time from when her heartbeat spiked to when her heart was ready for the next beat seemed to vary from beat to beat. Sometimes it was very short, and other times it was much longer. This worried Maureen because she knew the heart is supposed to beat very evenly. So she grabbed the phone and called her Aunt Eileen. Her aunt recognized it immediately as a heart condition that can cause fast, unpredictable heartbeats. It's called long QT syndrome, and it's very tricky to diagnose because most patients actually show no symptoms. But for those that do, the most common symptoms are lightheadedness, blurred vision, and fainting, just like Maureen had. Eileen recommended a doctor in Seattle who specialized in heart disorders. If Maureen did have long QT syndrome, he'd be able to confirm it. Maureen thanked her aunt for all her help and said she would call back once she had news. On a cold and gray winter morning the following month, Maureen was back at the hospital in Seattle, this time carrying a bag containing her workout clothes and running shoes. She followed a nurse into the cardiology wing, then into a changing room where she put on her workout clothes. A few minutes later, a man knocked and introduced himself as the doctor that Maureen's aunt had recommended. He led Maureen down the hallway to a larger room with a treadmill right in the middle. The doctor then hooked pulse monitors to Maureen's wrist and forearms, and he explained that he'd be monitoring her heartbeat and blood pressure while she ran on the treadmill. That way, he could determine what was changing inside her body during vigorous exercise. Maureen did some stretching and then began a brisk walk as the doctor slowly accelerated the treadmill. Soon, Maureen was sweating, huffing, and running at full speed. And all the while, the doctor just kept his eyes on his screen. And after running for a little bit, Maureen suddenly felt a very familiar sensation. Her peripheral vision turned foggy, her head felt woozy, and then before she could do anything, she was falling face first onto the rubber mat of the treadmill. When Maureen blinked back to consciousness, she looked up and saw this big group of men and women wearing hospital scrubs crouched down around her. One of them reached down and helped scoop her up into a sitting position. And as they did that, Maureen realized this was an emergency resuscitation team that had been called in when she fainted to resuscitate her. The doctor who had been overseeing the running test came over and crouched down by Maureen's side. He explained that her blood pressure and heart rate had plummeted when she was running, and then she passed out. It happened too fast for anyone to catch her. But the doctor told her that this test had actually been really useful because the results showed her issue wasn't a problem with her heart. It was more likely a complicated fainting condition sometimes seen in athletes. For Maureen, intense exercise was short-circuiting the nerve endings that regulated her heartbeat. This caused her blood pressure to drop, which in turn slowed the flow of blood to her brain. This is what made her feel lightheaded and dizzy to the point of fainting. Maureen, who was still sitting on the treadmill, was dazed by the diagnosis. Every doctor she had seen for the past 20 years had told her there was something wrong with her heart, that was the issue. But now it sounded like the problem was actually in her brain. Maureen asked the doctor, what do I do? How do I keep myself from fainting? The doctor smiled and told Maureen she was actually in luck. To get around the nerve issues and stabilize her blood pressure, all she would need to do was consume 1.5 teaspoons of ordinary table salt every day. Now, that's more salt than most people consume on a daily basis, but it was just enough above the normal amount that it would raise her blood pressure to the point where she would not faint the next time she did strenuous exercise. This sounded almost too easy to Maureen, but at the same time, she was grateful that she had a cure. She got to her feet, thanked everyone, and then went to go buy some salt. But a month later, on a cloudy, rainy Seattle afternoon, Maureen, who was very frustrated, stepped out onto the deck of her houseboat and dumped her salt into the water. She was totally done with this cure. Daily doses of salt had done nothing. For weeks, Maureen had been dissolving salt in a tall glass of warm water and forcing herself to drink it. At first, she held out hope that she might eventually start to see some changes, but she never did. Consuming all this salt had only made her bloated and anxious. It did nothing for her heart. Even on light jogs, Maureen's chest would feel tight, her stomach would turn queasy, and she'd be out of breath like she was about to faint. So whatever was wrong with her heart was definitely still wrong, and the salt was doing nothing to fix it. Frustrated, Maureen again called her Aunt Eileen for advice for what felt like the millionth time. This time, Eileen recommended that Maureen reach out to a very specific physician named Dr. Samir Saba, who specialized in a very special kind of MRI scan that identifies diseases and defects in the heart. Despite the diagnosis Maureen had received, Eileen still thought there really could be issues with her heart. And so this special MRI test, which gives very detailed pictures of the heart, might actually finally answer what was going on with Maureen. Now, Maureen was skeptical that anybody could figure out her mysterious condition after so many other doctors had tried and failed, but she had nowhere else to turn, and so Maureen asked her aunt to go ahead and book her one of these special MRI scans with Dr. Saba, and while she did that, Maureen would buy a flight to Pittsburgh. A week later, Maureen sat nervously in the front passenger seat as her Aunt Eileen drove to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Maureen watched out the window as a soft drizzle fell across the city, the same damp gray weather she was used to back in Seattle. She looked forward to being back on her cozy houseboat, but before she could go home, she still had this one last test she had to take. Maureen shuddered at the sight of yet another hospital as they got out and began walking towards the building. Once they went inside, Maureen followed a nurse through several sets of double doors into a white-walled, brightly lit MRI room. The nurse helped Maureen get undressed while she explained the procedure. A magnetic resonance image, or MRI, can create 3D images of the organs and tissues inside of a person's body. These detailed images allow doctors to find heart damage without needing to perform surgery on the patient. Maureen climbed up onto the stark white table and laid down flat. She heard a machine whir, then the table, with her on it, slid inside a narrow tube. At first, it felt claustrophobic, but Maureen shut her eyes and just pictured herself going for a run, and it put her at ease. Maureen lay there, listening to the sounds of the imaging machine, and then after about an hour, the noises stopped, and she, on her gurney, was slid back out from the tube. Maureen sat up, feeling strangely relaxed. Dr. Saba was there waiting for her, and he told her it would take a couple of weeks to get the results back, but he would call her as soon as he could. 2 weeks later, Maureen was back on her houseboat in Seattle, Washington, when her phone rang. The caller ID said University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Bracing herself for more frustrations or worse, Maureen answered and heard Dr. Saba's voice on the line. He told her he had some absolutely wild news. The issue with Maureen's heart was something that none of her previous doctors had thought of. Not only that, but it was something Maureen had lived with her entire life. The problem with Maureen's heart had nothing to do with its beat or nerve endings or scar tissue or any of the other things doctors had talked about for all these years. Instead, Maureen's heart was the wrong shape. The major artery carrying the blood from Maureen's heart to her body was literally in the wrong place, and so her unusual anatomy was causing Maureen's blackouts, not all the other rare conditions that doctors had thought previously. Maureen's right coronary artery was squished underneath another large blood vessel so that it was slightly constricted. When Maureen went about her normal activities, there wasn't any issues. But when Maureen exercised, her heart had to beat faster and pump more and more blood to keep up. But since her artery was in the wrong place and compressed, eventually it couldn't hold enough blood to meet the needs of the heart. This caused Maureen to faint. And no doctor would ever think to suspect this as the cause, because less than 1% of the entire population has a structural defect like this one. But the dangers of this rare condition are extremely real. Dr. Saba told Maureen that her collapse in the park was more likely a heart attack, and if it had lasted much longer, she would have died. Maureen was speechless. Across 20-plus years of seeing doctors throughout the country, no one had ever mentioned even the existence of a condition like this. She'd been living with a misshapen heart since she was born, and without Dr. Saba, it's very possible she would have never found out and likely died from it. Later that summer, Maureen underwent a 3-hour-long open-heart surgery at the University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle, in which surgeons successfully moved her right coronary artery, the one that was in the wrong spot, over to its proper location. Maureen still has lingering chest tightness and fatigue, but the operation allowed her to go back to her physically active life without fear. Gradually, she was able to start fully exercising again, and though her speed is not what it once was, Maureen has never fainted since. On May 9th, 2015, 46-year-old Marty Durham was sitting on his bed in Sand Lake, Michigan, and he couldn't stop laughing, because his pet African gray parrot, named Bud, was perched in his cage near the bed, and the bird was just swearing and cussing up a storm, and Marty thought it was hysterical. African gray parrots are considered to be some of the very best mimics. They can imitate specific voices, and they can also have vocabularies of close to 1,000 words, and Bud's vocabulary clearly included more than a few swear words. As his parrot continued to cuss away, Marty began to hear voices coming from the living room. So he told Bud he'd see him later. Then Marty placed his hands firmly on the bed, and he slowly pushed himself up to his feet. Immediately, Marty felt a twinge of pain shoot through his legs, but he shook it off. About 20 years earlier, Marty had been in this terrible car accident, and he'd suffered very serious injuries. Marty had eventually recovered, but he'd had to battle pain in his legs and back ever since. And that pain had actually only gotten worse over time as Marty got older, and so now Marty had to actually wear a brace on one of his legs just to help him walk. Marty made his way from the bedroom down a hallway towards the living room. Marty was tall with short brown hair and a mustache, and he was wearing a t-shirt and denim shorts. Marty stepped into the living room, and he saw his wife Glenna was speaking with his adult son, who had stopped by to visit. Marty had 3 children from a previous marriage, and all of them were grown up and out of the house. But they still came by fairly often to spend time with their dad and their stepmom. Marty gave his son a hug, and then he sat down on the couch next to Glenna. The living room was almost like a shrine to Marty's favorite pastime, which was hunting. There were buckheads mounted on the wall as trophies, and the brown leather couch was draped with all these blankets that had images of deer on them. Marty's son asked how Bud the parrot was doing, and Marty just started laughing again, and then he told his son about how Bud was just ranting in the bedroom. Marty and his ex-wife, Christina, had had Bud since the kids were young, so Marty's son had grown up with this bird. After chatting for a bit, Marty asked his son and his wife if they wanted to go outside, and they said yes. So Glenna stood up and she helped Marty get to his feet. Glenna, like Marty, was 46 years old, and she had long brown hair and she wore glasses. Glenna unlocked the back door, and then the 3 of them stepped out onto the new wooden deck that Marty and Glenna had just put in. It was an absolutely perfect day, about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Marty breathed in the fresh air, and he felt an utter sense of calm come over him. Being outside was like freedom to Marty. There was just nothing like it as far as he was concerned. And that was actually a huge reason why he'd bought the house where he and Glenna now lived. Years after Marty's terrible car accident, he had received some insurance money from the crash, and he had used that money to help him buy his blue wooden house in a very secluded area in the small rural town of Sand Lake. Marty loved the house itself, But it was actually the land that the house sat on that made him happier than almost anything else. From the deck, Marty looked out across the huge backyard at all the surrounding woods, and he couldn't help but think about his next hunting trip. If it were up to him, he'd go hunting or fishing every single day. But he knew he had to take it easy sometimes to give his legs a rest. Marty, Glenna, and Marty's son spent a good part of the day just sitting outside on the deck and talking. And then at some point, Marty's son said he needed to get home, so Marty stood up and he gave his son another hug, and then told him he'd see him soon. Then Marty's son said bye and left the deck and walked around the house towards the front where his car was, and Marty and Glenna just stayed out back on the deck. And hours later, Marty and Glenna were still outside, and they watched the sky turn gold and red as the sun began to set. Marty knew there was no such thing as a perfect life, and he had been through enough to know that everything could change in an instant. But there were times, like right now, when he just couldn't imagine being in a better place than he was. He had 3 kids that he loved dearly, and he was a grandfather with another grandchild on the way. He had this amazing house on this great land, and he was married to someone who he genuinely loved, Glenna. Marty and Glenna had actually first met when they were teenagers, and they had been attracted to each other right away. They began dating, and for a while, they spent as much time together as they could. Both Marty and Glenna had a shared love of nature, so they were always out and about walking around in the forest and going on long walks together, and they also spent a lot of time together hanging out with friends in town. But then, to the shock of a lot of their friends, Marty and Glenna had broken up and gone their separate ways. And not long after they had broken up, they both got married to other people. Marty married Christina, his first wife, and they had 3 kids together and their pet parrot Bud, and for years they had a pretty happy life together. And Glenna had gotten married and had kids of her own too. After Marty's car accident, Christina, his first wife, helped him a lot during his recovery. But their relationship started to become strained over time, and they ended up getting divorced about 5 years after Marty's wreck. Then Marty had moved out, bought the blue wooden house on the amazing land, and continued to raise his kids. It turned out that Glenna had also gotten a divorce, and Marty and Glenna, who had almost been inseparable as teenagers, ultimately reconnected and rekindled their relationship. Glenna had moved back in with Marty back in 2001, and a few years later, they had gotten married. Some of their friends thought it seemed like no time had passed at all, like somehow Marty and Glenna were the exact same together as they had been when they were kids. They could still just sit down and talk for hours at a time and not get bored, and they still love spending loads of time outdoors together. On the backyard deck, Marty and Glenna watched the last rays of sun disappear and then went inside the house. Glenna went to the kitchen to get dinner ready, and Marty headed to the bedroom. On the way to the bedroom, he checked the front door to make sure it was locked. Marty had always been someone who was very cautious, and so he liked to keep all the doors locked and deadbolted even when he and Glenna were home during the day. Some of that precaution was really just because that was Marty's nature, but it was also because Marty knew he kept several hunting weapons and handguns in the house, so if someone did come into the home, he knew things could turn violent very quickly. And even though they did live in a pretty secluded area, there was a road not too far from them, so people did pass by them, and Marty just didn't want to take any chances. Marty walked into his bedroom, and he saw Bud the parrot bobbing back and forth on his perch. Then Marty stepped into the bathroom, and he took a prescription pain pill out of a bottle on the counter, and he washed the pill down with water from the sink. Marty took a deep breath, went back into the bedroom, and sat down on the bed. Marty didn't usually take as many pain pills as were prescribed to him for a day, but sometimes in the evening, his leg pain got a lot worse, and the pills really helped. But even with the big inconvenience of chronic pain, and some of the other issues his car accident had caused over the years, Marty still tried hard not to dwell on the past. And as he sat there waiting for his pain meds to kick in, he smiled because he was thankful for what he had. A great family, a house he loved, and a foul-mouthed talking bird who could always make him laugh. On the evening of May 11th, 2015, so 2 days after Marty's son had come to visit, the smell of Italian food wafted through Marty and Glenna's house. Marty walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. Then Glenna came over and put down a plate of spaghetti and garlic bread in front of him, and then she also put another plate down for herself, and she sat down across from Marty. As they ate dinner, Marty talked about wanting to plan a trip with some friends to go hunting wild boar and ram. Those types of hunting trips were far more complicated to coordinate than deer hunting trips in this area. And the pain in Marty's legs often made it very difficult for him to drive, which might make the trip even more complicated. Still, Marty was excited to try to put the trip together, and Glenna didn't have any objections. She often drove Marty to his doctor's appointments or other important places he had to go, and so they could figure something out for the hunting trip if they needed to. After dinner, Glenna picked up the plates and left them on the counter in the kitchen. Then Marty and Glenna went to the living room and watched TV for a couple of hours. Finally, just after midnight, Marty was tired, so he said goodnight to Glenna. He got up and he went to their bedroom. Glenna told him she was going to stay up a bit longer and look at her phone. Once he was in the bedroom, Marty undressed and got into bed. He then said goodnight to Bud the parrot, then flipped off the light and went to sleep. But hours later, at about 5 a.m., Marty suddenly woke up feeling really startled. He heard his closet door open, and then he heard shouting. And then Bud the parrot began squawking from his perch, and Marty was just so confused he had no idea what was going on. But then Marty's eyes focused in the low light, and he saw there was someone standing in his bedroom just a few feet away. And so Marty shouted at this person in the room, and the bird squawked even louder. Over 24 hours later, so on May 13th, Marty and Glenna's neighbor watched smoke rising into the air not far from her house. Then the neighbor heard the screams of sirens and saw a fire truck barreling down her road. The neighbor was very worried about Marty and Glenna. She had texted both of them several times the day before, but neither of them had responded, and this just was not like them. The neighbor and Marty and Glenna were all very good friends, and they talked and texted all the time, and they were always very quick to get back to each other. The neighbor had also gone by Marty and Glenna's house the day before, but the couple hadn't been home. And so now that this neighbor is seeing fire trucks come bombing down her road and she's seeing smoke in the air, naturally she worried that the fire might be coming from Marty and Glenna's house. And so the neighbor just ran outside and began running down the street towards Marty and Glenna's house. And as she ran down the road, she saw the fire trucks up ahead coming to a stop and the firefighters jumping down off the truck to get the hoses ready to put out the fire. But as the neighbor went down the road, she realized that it was actually a small fire that was not on Marty and Glenna's property. Their house was not on fire. And so the neighbor was totally relieved, but since the neighbor was already outside, they decided they would just go to Marty and Glenna's house to see if maybe they were home now. But when the neighbor crossed Marty and Glenna's huge front yard and arrived on their front porch and knocked on the door, there was no answer. The neighbor thought about leaving, but she just couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong with Marty and Glenna. So the neighbor just reached down and grabbed the doorknob and tried to turn it, and shockingly, the doorknob turned because the door was unlocked. And this really frightened the neighbor. She knew how much Marty liked to keep all the doors locked and deadbolted basically all the time. The neighbor cautiously opened up the door and then stepped inside the house, and then began calling out to Marty and Glenna. But the house was silent. So the neighbor turned the corner and walked into the living room, and when she did, it was like her heart skipped a beat, because the place was a total wreck. A lamp had been tipped over and knocked off a table, and there were papers and trash scattered all across the floor. Then the neighbor heard the parrot, Bud, begin to squawk in Marty and Glenna's bedroom. So the neighbor walked down the hallway to the bedroom, and they stepped inside, and Bud, who was in the back cage, squawked louder and louder, and the neighbor just kind of looked around the bedroom, and at first it just looked like a normal bedroom, except for the fact that all the blankets from the bed were basically piled on the ground right in front of the door. So the neighbor stepped over those blankets and began walking towards the back of the bedroom to see what was next to the bed, and when she saw what was on the ground next to the bed, the neighbor just froze. Because there, next to the bed on the ground, was Marty, in his underwear, with his face and chest covered in blood. The neighbor was totally shocked, and they turned to run out of the room, but as soon as she turned, she looked down and realized now from her vantage point, she could see that actually Glenna was inside of those blankets that she had stepped over when she first came in. And now the neighbor was seeing Glenna's face, and Glenna's skin was pale and her hair was matted down with blood. And the neighbor just screamed and jumped over Glenna and ran out of that house and then screamed for all the firefighters who were right nearby putting out that small fire. And one of the firefighters saw the neighbor and rushed over to her, and after she explained what she just found in her friend's house, the firefighter motioned for two of the first responders, and then the three of them ran into Marty and Glenna's house. And then as soon as they walked into the bedroom and actually saw Marty and Glenna on the ground, the first responders knew they were dealing with a crime scene. And so one of the firefighters called police dispatch, and he said they had just found 2 dead bodies and they needed police on the scene ASAP. About 2 hours later, at around 5:30 p.m., Sergeant Gary Wilson of the Michigan State Police arrived in front of Marty and Glenna's house. Sergeant Wilson saw an ambulance and a fire truck nearby, and there were multiple firefighters, paramedics, and state troopers standing outside the house. Sergeant Wilson got out of his car and walked over to one of the firefighters. The firefighter explained that they had to put out a small fire in the area, but then this woman had come running out of Marty and Glenna's house screaming for help. The firefighter said, once they had seen what was inside of the house, members of the fire department and other first responders were instructed to stay outside until police arrived, because it was believed the house was now a crime scene. Now, Sergeant Wilson had been told all of this already by police dispatch. He also had been told that he was very likely responding to a double suicide. But when Wilson approached the house, one of the state troopers went over to meet him, and that trooper believed there was a strong chance they were actually dealing with a double homicide, not double suicide. Wilson followed the trooper inside the house to the bedroom, and when Wilson saw Marty on the floor, he was also pretty sure the man had not killed himself. Marty had multiple gunshot wounds, and there was no weapon nearby. Then Wilson stepped over to the pile of blankets on the floor to get a better look at Glenna's body, but when he crouched down on one knee and leaned in closer to her, he heard a loud gasp. Glenna's eyes opened, and then she screamed. Wilson stood and stumbled back a few steps. He was in shock, but he quickly called for a paramedic and kept shouting over and over again that she's alive, guys, get in here. Paramedics rushed into the bedroom and began working to get Glenna oxygen. Then they put her on a stretcher, wheeled her outside, and got her into the ambulance. As the ambulance sped away to the hospital, Wilson stood in Glenna and Marty's bedroom, trying to recover from the shock of what had just happened. And then once he'd caught his breath and calmed down, Sergeant Wilson called in that one of the victims, who everybody thought was dead, was actually alive. And also, Wilson said he believed they were not dealing with a suicide, but a murder, and so he needed a forensics team. Not long after Glenna woke up in the bedroom, a state forensics team arrived at the property and began doing a thorough sweep. In the bedroom, not far from Marty's body, they found several bullet casings. They also found a key to Marty's gun safe on the floor, and they located the safe in the closet. So Wilson's first thought was that someone who knew that Marty kept guns in his safe had taken the key, gotten a weapon out of the safe, and then using that weapon, they had killed Marty and attempted to kill Glenna. And the idea that the killer was someone the couple knew made sense because there was no sign of forced entry in the house. Now, Marty and Glenna's neighbor had found the front door unlocked, so it was possible that maybe Marty or Glenna had unknowingly welcomed the killer into their home. But the forensics team also found something very strange in the bedroom. Marty had died while clutching a patch of hair in his right hand, so they would need to run DNA tests to see if the hair matched Marty's or if it belonged to someone else, like maybe his killer. Sergeant Wilson heard someone calling to him from the living room, so he stepped out of the bedroom and headed that way. When he got there, he saw a forensics officer on the ground bagging a piece of evidence. The officer had found a .22 caliber Ruger revolver underneath one of the living room chairs. Sergeant Wilson knew they would have to wait for ballistics testing to see if this revolver really was the murder weapon, but Wilson already had a strong feeling that very likely this was the murder weapon. And he was almost positive that that gun must have come out of Marty's safe. After several hours in the house, Wilson felt like he still had a lot of questions to answer, so he called the hospital in hopes that Glenna was now in stable condition and able to talk to him about who had shot her and her husband. But doctors would tell him that Glenna, unfortunately, was still very much recovering from her wound and not really in a good position to talk to him, at least not yet. So Sergeant Wilson decided if he couldn't talk to Marty's wife, then he would just start his investigation with other members of Marty's family, his kids. On May 14th, so a day after Marty's body had been discovered, Marty's 2 sons and his daughter climbed under the crime scene tape outside of Marty's house and approached the front door. They all stood at the door, still in total shock. How could this place that had made them so happy over the years now be just a violent crime scene? It just didn't make sense to them. The siblings entered the house. They were there to pick up Bud the parrot so they could bring him back to their mother, Marty's ex-wife Christina. But before they actually made it to the bedroom to grab Bud, they were all stunned by the mess in the living room. Their dad and their stepmother had always kept the house very neat and tidy, so it didn't even look like the same place. Then something caught their attention. A large manila envelope was on the living room floor amongst the mess, and so one of Marty's sons crouched down and opened the envelope and looked inside. And he showed the contents to his brother and sister, and they all agreed this was something they should hold on to. Then they went to the bedroom to get Bud the parrot. Soon after they had left, the siblings brought Bud to their mother's house. Then they decided to show the police the manila envelope they had found. Later that day, after Marty's children had contacted the police, they were brought into the local station to be interviewed. Sergeant Wilson had already planned to begin his investigation with Marty's kids, but now that they had this manila envelope, he was so eager to speak with them. Wilson knew there was a good chance that he was simply dealing with 3 grief-stricken young people who had just lost their father, but he still could not eliminate any of Marty's kids as potential suspects, at least not yet. So Wilson first led Marty's oldest son, Justin, into a small office at the station. Wilson wanted to meet with each of Marty's kids separately. He believed that if one of the kids had information about the case, they were more likely to share it if each of them was on their own. In the office, Wilson told Justin they were not accusing him of anything. They just wanted to talk to him to see if he had any information that could help with their investigation. And Justin was very calm and seemed eager to cooperate. Wilson asked Justin if he knew about any enemies his father might have, or if his dad had recently had a falling out with any of his friends. Justin said he couldn't think of anyone. He said his dad was really close with his neighbors and his hunting buddies, and they all seemed to get along really well. But then, Justin got a look on his face like he just remembered something. He looked up at Wilson and told him that there were a bunch of people who knew his father had a big supply of prescription pain medication inside of his house. When Wilson heard this, he immediately sat back in his chair and just thought for a second. At the time, the opioid epidemic in the United States was near its height. Prescription painkillers, like the ones Marty took, were in very high demand, and addicts had been known to commit terrible crimes to get a hold of these drugs. So Sergeant Wilson started to wonder if someone who knew Marty had killed him and attempted to kill his wife simply to get a hold of Marty's pills. After they talked a bit longer, Wilson thanked Justin for his cooperation and told him police would be in touch if they needed anything else. Later that day, Wilson and other investigators met with Marty's 2 other kids, and their version of events surrounding their visit to their dad and stepmother's house and the manila envelope they found in the living room were all basically the same. So, in the following days, investigators met with other people who were close to Marty to see if they had any information they might be able to add. And one of the people investigators spoke to said she knew that Marty's guns were not the only things that he and Glenna kept locked up in their safe. They also kept a couple of $1,000s in cash locked up. But, as Sergeant Wilson knew, no cash had been found inside of that safe. And so suddenly, the information about this missing money and the information Marty's son had given about Marty's pills started to paint a picture of what happened for investigators. And so now their theory was that someone Marty and Glenna knew had possibly come to their house with the intention of robbing them of their cash and their prescription drugs. So Wilson wanted to meet with anyone who had known about the safe in the couple's house to see if he could track down the missing money and Marty and Glenna's attacker. It had only been about a week since the attack, but Sergeant Wilson and the rest of his team were already getting frustrated. They felt like they had all these puzzle pieces right in front of them, but none of the pieces seemed to connect. There was the missing money from the safe, there was that manila envelope that Marty's kids had found in the living room, and there was the potential that somebody had wanted to steal Marty's prescription pain pills. But as investigators spoke to just about anybody who had any connection to Marty and Glenna, they couldn't find any evidence that sort of pointed to a particular person, a primary suspect, and they still had no leads on the missing money. Wilson had desperately hoped that Glenna would be able to provide the missing pieces that would make the puzzle kind of come together, but she was still recovering in the hospital, and so for now, an interview was still not possible. But when the investigation began to look like it was genuinely running into a dead end and might go cold, Michigan State Trooper Barry Wolf took a phone call at his desk. Wolf, like other members of the investigative team, had been worried about the lack of progress they were making. But as he listened to this caller on the other line, he wasn't sure if he was getting the tip police had been hoping for, or if he was about to be sent on an insane wild goose chase. The caller was a woman who was named Fran Fallon. She was the wife of one of Marty's cousins, and she was a self-proclaimed psychic. On the phone, Fran told Officer Wolf that she had received important information about Marty's murder during a psychic reading, and she'd like to share this information with the police. And so Wolf told Fran he'd be right over to see her. Then, Officer Wolf told Sergeant Wilson about this call, and neither of the men really believed in psychic phenomena. But a person saying they had potentially important information about this case, especially someone who had a family connection to the victim, couldn't be ignored. So after speaking to Wilson, Wolf left the building, got into his cruiser, and went to meet Fran at her house to see what her supposed visions had shown her. When Wolf arrived, he found Fran sitting on her back porch, and she motioned for him to join her. Wolf introduced himself, thanked Fran for contacting him, and then took a seat next to her. Fran spoke in a low but very confident voice. She knew some people thought she was crazy or just making things up, but she trusted her psychic gifts, and she felt like the police should trust them too. Fran reached down beside her and took a small notebook out of a folder. She told Wolf that she had written down information she'd received during a recent psychic vision. Then she flipped open the notebook and began reading. Fran told Wolf that it was important for police to look under the couch or the love seat in Marty and Glenna's living room. Then Fran looked up and stared directly into Wolf's eyes and told him that Marty's right hand was also going to be very important to the investigation. When she said this, Wolf sat back in his chair and just stared at Fran in disbelief. Investigators had found that Ruger underneath a chair in the living room. Sure, that wasn't the same as a couch or a love seat, but that was pretty close. Also, Wolf was shocked to hear Fran mention Marty's right hand because Marty had been found clutching that patch of hair in his right hand. But Wolf's first thought was not that this woman was actually psychic. It was instead that she clearly had information about a crime scene that only somebody who had been there would know about. And so Wolf did not want to alarm Fran in any way that he could be onto her, and so instead he just smiled and told her that this was very interesting, and then he asked her where she had been at the time Marty was murdered. And Fran would tell him that she had been with her daughter. After that, Wolf thanked Fran again for getting in touch with him, and then he walked off her porch and went back to his car. Once he was inside and turned it back on, he gunned the engine and sped back to the station to tell the rest of the investigative team about this weird meeting. And once he did tell them about this weird meeting, the Michigan State Police had to either accept that Fran really got this information from a psychic reading she'd done, or they would have to add a local psychic to their list of suspects. Sergeant Wilson told investigators to follow up on Fran's alibi, and he could barely believe the turn this investigation was taking. But it wouldn't be long before Wilson realized having a psychic involved was not remotely the weirdest thing about this case. In October of 2015, so almost 5 months after the attack that left Marty dead, Sergeant Wilson finally got the call he'd been waiting for. Glenna had been released from the hospital, and she was now able to speak with police. Investigators had spent the last few months searching for that lost money and looking into the psychic's background, and they had come up empty. They had potential suspects, but none of them seemed all that viable. But now, Wilson would be able to talk to someone who was literally there when the attack happened, Glenna, and he hoped she'd be able to clear up a lot of the questions that he and his team still had. Glenna met with Wilson at the police station, and after they made it into the interview room, Wilson asked her, what do you remember about the day that you and your husband were attacked? And immediately, when Glenna began to talk, Wilson knew he was not going to get the clear-cut evidence he had been hoping for. Glenna told him she'd been struggling with her memory ever since she arrived at the hospital. She said she could barely remember anything about the day of the shooting, or even the days leading up to it. Wilson knew Glenna was dealing with a serious head injury, so her memory loss did not come as much of a surprise. But he still believed Glenna was going to be the key to figuring out who killed Marty. So Wilson began talking to Glenna about pieces of evidence that had been found at the scene, hoping maybe something would spark her memory. But by the end of the interview, Glenna had not remembered anything that could point the investigation in any one direction, and so Wilson began to feel lost again. So, as the weeks and months passed, investigators continued to pursue all of their potential leads, but they still had no clear killer, and Marty's family was now also starting to become very frustrated. They wanted answers, and they wanted some kind of closure. But even as the one-year anniversary of Marty's murder approached, the case was still open, and people close to Marty had no idea if it would ever be closed. In May of 2016, so a year after Marty was killed, a news reporter for a Grand Rapids, Michigan TV station stared at a video playing on his computer screen. His eyes were wide and his mouth was hanging open. This guy couldn't believe what he was watching. On the video, Marty's pet parrot, Bud, was clinging to the side of his cage and he was shouting in Marty's voice. Then the parrot's voice would completely change and he would speak in somebody else's voice who was not shouting, and then the parrot would shift back into Marty's voice and he would keep on shouting. The reporter was watching Bud mimic an argument the bird clearly had heard between Marty and somebody else, and the reporter was almost certain the other voice that Bud was mimicking belonged to Marty's killer, and that this argument must have taken place right before the murder. Because at one point in the video, Bud mimicked Marty's voice by yelling, "Don't fucking shoot!" The reporter watched the entire video, and then when it was done, he watched it again. And afterwards, he knew it had to be aired. The news station contacted Marty's first wife, Christina, who had gotten Bud back after Marty was killed. Christina told producers at the station that she was the one who had shot that video about a month after Marty's murder, but she had only told people who were close to her about it. She had never intended for it to make the news. But around the year anniversary of Marty's death, Marty's parents had done a follow-up interview with a local TV station, and during that interview, the video of Bud the parrot screaming "Don't fucking shoot" had come up, and eventually that video of Bud was shown to the local news crew. And then somehow, the video made its way to the much larger TV station in Grand Rapids. And not long after that, the Grand Rapids TV station played Bud's video on the news, and soon the story got picked up all over the world. Suddenly, Bud the parrot seemed like a hero. He was like a key witness to an unsolved murder, and everyone believed he was going to be the key to solving the case. The worldwide attention Bud's video brought to Marty's murder might have put added pressure on the investigative team, but police insisted that the parrot video did not change the way they were pursuing the case. Then, in June, a month after Bud's video appeared on TV, investigators announced they had actually made an arrest in Marty's murder case. Police maintained that Bud the parrot's supposed eyewitness account of the murder had nothing to do with the arrest. It just so happened that at this time, they had finally figured out who took the money from Marty's safe, and soon after that, they had discovered a piece of evidence that broke the case wide open and led them to Marty's killer. Based on evidence found at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened in the early morning hours of May 12, 2015, when someone killed Marty Durham in his bedroom. At 5 a.m. on May 12, 2015, the glow from the killer's phone lit their face as they walked down the hallway inside of Marty and Glenna's house. The killer was breathing heavily, and they were scared and nervous, but they managed to walk quietly towards the bedroom. Once they got there, the killer opened the bedroom door and stepped inside. The low light from the killer's phone provided enough illumination that the killer could see the African gray parrot in its cage. The killer quickly walked across the room to the closet, then they opened it up and used their phone light to locate the key to the large gun safe that was inside. Once they had the key, the killer held their breath and unlocked the safe. Tucked away amongst several hunting rifles, they found a loaded .22 caliber Ruger revolver. The killer grabbed the gun and stared at it in their hand for a second. Then they turned, stepped out of the closet, approached the bed, and just started yelling. And immediately, Marty, who was in bed, he sat up, totally startled, and the noise caused Bud the parrot to start squawking, which only added to the confusion. Marty kind of shook himself awake and he saw the killer just standing there, and still not sure what was happening, Marty just began screaming too. So Marty, the parrot, and the killer are all yelling. But then, in the light from the killer's phone and the glow from the moon that was coming in through the window, Marty noticed the killer had a gun by their side. And so Marty pulled himself up and out of bed, and right away he very likely felt that pain shooting through his legs and back, and at the same time Bud keeps squawking from his cage, and the killer kept shouting at Marty. I mean, it was absolutely chaos, but Marty was still hopeful he could maybe get out of there. And so Marty raised up his hands in a defensive position and tried to walk past the killer. The killer raised the gun and aimed it right at Marty's chest, and Marty screamed, "Don't fucking shoot!" But the killer fired. They fired 3 shots in rapid succession, hitting Marty in the chest again and again and again. Then the killer fired 2 more times, and those bullets struck Marty's forearm and his back as he fell. Marty collapsed on the floor, dead. And the killer just stood there, staring down at Marty's body. Then the killer took a deep breath, calmly walked out of the bedroom, and made their way towards the front door, and they unlocked it. Then the killer made their way to the living room, and they tipped a lamp off an end table onto the floor. Then they emptied a desk drawer and some shelves and made a total mess of the place. Then the killer just kind of stood there, scanning around their house, looking at what they had just done. So far, their plan had gone exactly the way they hoped, but the hardest part was yet to come. Finally, the killer took several deep breaths, doing their best to stay calm and steady. Then they raised their gun and placed the barrel behind their right ear, and they pulled the trigger. Immediately, blood began pouring out of the wound, and the room began to spin, but the killer kept their balance long enough to toss the gun under a nearby living room chair. Then the killer stumbled back into the bedroom and fell down onto the ground, and before they passed out, they grabbed a huge pile of blankets nearby and pulled them up and over their head. It would turn out Glenna had murdered Marty, and then obviously shot herself in the head. It turned out that Marty and Glenna's marriage had not been as perfect as some of their friends believed. Over the years, Glenna had racked up a huge amount of debt. She had lost about $75,000 gambling at nearby casinos, and as a result, she had stopped making mortgage payments on their house. But Marty never knew any of that. Not long before the murder, Glenna had learned that the house that Marty loved so much was now going into foreclosure. And so soon, he would learn the truth, and they would both be forced out. Early on in the investigation, police had actually learned about the pending foreclosure, and they discovered Glenna's gambling habit. So they started to think that Glenna had killed Marty and then tried to kill herself, seeing a murder-suicide as her only way out. And this murder-suicide theory was only bolstered when police looked inside of that manila envelope that Marty's kids had found when they went to Marty's house to get Bud. The manila envelope contained several letters that Glenna had written to her kids and to her ex-husband. In the letters, Glenna expressed how sorry she was and asked them to please take care of each other. Police believed those letters sounded like suicide notes. But in a case involving a psychic and a talking bird, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Because if it was a murder-suicide, why had thousands of dollars been taken from the safe? Why was the house completely wrecked? And why had the gun been hidden in the living room when Marty and Glenna were found in their bedroom? Those were questions investigators had to answer if they were ever going to determine what had really happened. Finally, investigators discovered who had taken the money from the safe because Marty's kids had come forward and admitted they took the cash when they went to collect Bud the parrot. Even though Marty's kids had taken the money, police still didn't consider them primary suspects. Instead, they thought Marty's kids were just young and foolish and had made a very bad decision. So, with the money from the safe now accounted for, investigators were able to rule it out as a motive for the murder. And the psychic's alibi eventually checked out, so the investigators crossed her off of their suspect list, but they would be left wondering how she seemed to know undisclosed details about the crime scene. DNA tests conducted on the hair found inside of Marty's hand also did not end up helping investigators. So all of this brought Sergeant Wilson and his team back to the possibility of a murder and failed suicide attempt committed by Glenna. But of course, there were still unanswered questions. It wasn't like they had found the gun in Glenna's hand. Then, in early summer of 2016, the media and the public latched onto that viral video of Bud the parrot saying, "Don't fucking shoot," and many claimed the other voice that Bud was speaking in sounded an awful lot like Glenna. But police continued to rely on more common investigative techniques to determine if Glenna was, in fact, the killer. They dug deep into Glenna's phone records and internet history, and when they had a clear picture of Glenna's online activity, they got the break in the case they had been looking for. It turned out that hours before Marty's murder, Glenna had been online researching various aspects of the .22 caliber Ruger revolver, the type of gun used to kill Marty. And some investigators believed Glenna had learned a lot more than just how to fire or reload the weapon. They thought she had found a way to shoot herself that would allow her to live and enable her to keep functioning even after she had pulled the trigger. In fact, a neurosurgeon would testify in court that the wounds found behind Glenna's ear were non-lethal, and that those wounds would not necessarily result in a loss of consciousness. This meant that Glenna could have shot herself in the head in the living room and then still managed to hide the gun, get back to the bedroom, and get into position under the blankets, all before she was found. So, as bizarre as this case had seemed at times, investigators believed they had solved the most important part of the puzzle, that Glenna had murdered Marty. Some people close to the case would continue to believe that the crime was still the result of Glenna's failed murder-suicide plan, meaning Glenna really did intend to end her life, but just didn't, because where she shot herself was non-lethal, even though Glenna denied the letters she had written to her family were suicide notes. Others believed there were even darker motives at play, and that Glenna murdered Marty, then tried to make it look like a robbery, and then also tried to make herself look like a victim too, so they didn't believe suicide was ever part of Glenna's plan, that she definitely did try to intentionally shoot the part of her head that wouldn't kill her. This was all a big con. But it's not clear what Glenna's motives were for doing this. Like, what did she stand to gain by killing her husband and framing this whole thing? It just didn't make any sense. But regardless of what the actual reason was for why Glenna did what she did, by the summer of 2016, police had enough evidence to arrest her. Glenna was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of 2019, Bud the parrot was living with Marty's first wife, Christina, and a fellow African gray parrot named Ozzy. Christina said the two birds have become best friends.
On April 28, 2000, a 24-year-old named Yuri Lipsky was standing in front of a cafe in Dahab, Egypt, overlooking the Red Sea. He had traveled all the way to the Sinai Peninsula from Moscow in order to film himself swimming through the Arch, but now it was looking like that probably wasn't going to happen. The Arch is an 85-foot-long underwater tunnel that connects a massive sinkhole right on Dahab's shoreline called the Blue Hole to the Red Sea. To get to the Arch, you need to enter the Blue Hole directly and descend straight down 181 feet, where you'll reach the top of the tunnel on the northeast side. But there's a catch. If on your descent you happen to miss the ceiling of this arch, which apparently it's pretty easy to do, you run the risk of going too deep. Now, going too deep does not mean you're going to miss the tunnel altogether. The arch actually starts at 181 feet, but then goes all the way down to 393 feet. So it's a huge, huge opening. The risk of going too deep has to do with how your body responds to the type of gas you're breathing. For those who are unfamiliar with diving, generally speaking, you have two types of dives. There's recreational diving, where you breathe the same air that you breathe on the surface. They literally jam air directly into scuba bottles. You breathe that, and you go down to 130 feet. That's the recommended bottom depth that you would go down breathing regular air. And then there is technical diving, where you breathe a special mixture of gases. Typically, it's going to be a mixture of helium, nitrogen, and oxygen that allow you to go below 130 feet. This type of diving is exponentially more dangerous and requires all sorts of additional training. Because the minimum depth you would need to go to in order to access the arch is 181 feet, that puts you well in the technical diving range, which means you should be diving mixed gas and have special training and equipment. But year after year, people try to dive down to the arch and go through it on regular air. And year after year, people die doing it. When your body absorbs too much nitrogen, you can get something called nitrogen narcosis, which is a lot like being drunk. And in extreme cases, divers who get this have been known to remove their mouthpiece and inhale water, believing they are actually on the surface. Below 130 feet, your body absorbs nitrogen much faster, and regular air is a whopping 78% nitrogen. So the risk of getting nitrogen narcosis is exponentially higher if you're breathing regular air below 130 feet. Also, oxygen can become toxic the deeper you go in the water column. It can lead to blackouts and convulsions that if you don't have someone there to literally physically move you up in the water column, you won't recover from it and you'll die. Regular air contains 21% oxygen, which is a lot of oxygen. So if you're diving regular air below 130 feet, you are at an increased risk of developing O2 toxicity. Now, to be clear, it is possible on regular air to dive down to 181 feet and make it through the arch and come out the other side and be just fine. But you're realistically at 181 feet pushing the absolute boundary of what you can get away with on regular air. Below 200 feet, you're probably dead. So if you're attempting to swim through the arch on regular air, you need to be paying very close attention to your depth as you descend so that you don't miss the arch and accidentally drift down below 181 feet to the very deadly 200 feet and beyond. So earlier in the day, Yuri had gone down to the edge of the blue hole and he had found one of the diving instructors that taught inside the blue hole. His name was Tarek Omar, and he asked him if he'd be willing to take him down to the arch to help him film himself going through the arch. And Tarek said, yes, but I need to train you for 2 weeks before you're going to be considered qualified to do that. And you need a special setup with a special gas mixture to do this dive. And Yuri was like, well, I'm leaving in 2 days to head back to Moscow, so I need to do this dive now. Is there any way you can do it today or tomorrow even? And Tarek was like, no, that's not how this works. And Tarek understood this more than anybody else, because in addition to teaching diving at the blue hole, Tarek's job was to dive down to the bottom and retrieve the dead bodies of inexperienced or overconfident divers that attempted the archway and didn't make it. Although there is not an official body count of how many people have perished inside of the blue hole, locals believe it's as high as 200 people just in the last decade. After Tarek was unwilling to take him without properly training him and outfitting him with the right equipment, Yuri thanked him and went on to a couple different other diving instructors with the same request. Will you take me in the next couple of days? And they all said, no, we need to train you and you need special equipment. And so finally, after no one was willing to do this, Yuri just left. Later that day, owners of cafes that overlooked the blue hole remember seeing a young man who was by himself walk to the edge of the blue hole. He puts on all of his scuba gear, he puts on a helmet and then straps a big camera to the top and ratchets it down. And then after he's got all his stuff on, he jumps into the blue hole and he disappears. That man was Yuri. A few days later, Yuri's family back home in Moscow did not see him get off the flight he was supposed to be on, and they reported him missing. Tarek Omar was contacted to go down into the blue hole and see if Yuri was down there. Tarek hopped in the blue hole, he went to the bottom, and sure enough, lying face down at the bottom was Yuri. When they brought Yuri to the surface, they realized his camera had been running the whole time, and he had actually filmed his final moments. Yuri's final video exists online so you can watch it for yourself, but here is a description of what happens. After situating his camera on his head just the way he wanted it, he hit record, and then he jumped into the water. It was determined later on that Yuri was breathing regular air out of his tanks. The camera submerges under the water, and then Yuri begins to sink very quickly into the blue hole. But his breathing seems normal, and he's not thrashing around, so it seems like it's a controlled descent. But at some point, you hear Yuri trying to activate his buoyancy compensator. Basically, it's this life jacket, to describe it simply, that sits on your gear that you have a demand valve where you can inflate and deflate the air into it to neutralize your buoyancy. Or, in an emergency situation, you can fully inflate it and stop yourself from sinking. In fact, you'll rise to the surface. But he's trying to activate his buoyancy compensator to slow down his descent, and the air is escaping his compensator. There's a leak, and he can't slow down his descent. Now, Yuri was wearing a weight belt, which is very common in diving. In fact, I don't really know of all that many dives that you wouldn't use a weight belt. And any diver knows that there is a quick release function on your weight belt. Specifically, if you're in an uncontrolled descent or if you're in an emergency situation and need to get to the surface, you can jettison your weight belt and go to the surface. But Yuri was panicking and he was fixated on his buoyancy compensator that he was desperately trying to activate, and it was failing. And so he's not going for his weight belt. And then he rockets past the entrance to the arch. So he goes below 181 feet, he goes below 200 feet, and he goes all the way to the bottom where he hits the bottom at 392 feet. And then he begins to slide because the bottom of the blue hole was actually at an angle, and that archway went all the way to the bottom of the hole. And if you slipped out of the blue hole, it was a sheer drop off for thousands of feet. And you see on camera, Yuri rolls over and he's desperately clawing into the mud to stop himself from sliding out of the blue hole to definite death. and he's trying to get himself to stop, and finally he anchors himself in the dirt. And it's calm for a second, and he's kind of looking around. It's very clear he's confused, and then it goes still. And it's believed at this point he either removed his mouthpiece because of nitrogen narcosis, he pulled it out and inhaled water, or he was dealing with O2 toxicity and he blacked out and the mouthpiece came out. But either way, he drowned. Our next story is called Drown or Glory. There is a remote cliff face in northern England that rarely gets tourists. If you were standing in front of it, you would see this little stream that went into a break in the limestone. It's this little tiny hole, and that stream is called the Mosdale Beck. If you crouched down and walked through that hole, you would be entering the Mosdale Caverns, which since 1967 have been permanently sealed off to cavers. Once inside the Mosdale Caverns entranceway, you could look down and see that little stream, the Mosdale Beck, would be going between your legs, and then right in front of you, it would split in two distinct directions down respective tunnels. To the right, the water flows down 7 miles of accessible passageway. However, most of it is incredibly tight and it's prone to flooding. As a result, fewer people have seen the far reaches of the right side of Mosdale Cavern than have stepped on the moon. To the left, the water goes through these impenetrable rocks that no one has gotten past. In fact, no one knows what's beyond these rocks. However, scientists have determined the water that goes left at the entranceway will re-emerge 18 days later, 5 miles away, 900 feet lower in a pool called the Black Keld. The massive tunnel system that we know exists but has yet to be explored that connects the entranceway to Black Keld is referred to as the missing link. You would think cavers from all over the world would be clamoring to get inside that accessible side, the right side of Mosdale Caverns, and try to find a secret access point back to the missing link, to be the first person to discover that, to stake your claim and say, that was me. But in fact, since the Mosdale Caverns was discovered in 1941 until 1967, almost no one went in Mosdale Caverns. Endless, tight, water-filled crawls with names like Drown or Glory made Mosdale Caverns feel like too big of a risk to be worth it. But in 1967, 10 extremely fit, extremely experienced cavers said, you know what? We are going in Mosdale Cavern and we are going to find that entrance to the missing link. So on June 24th, 1967, these 10 cavers entered Mosdale Caverns. They went right into the accessible 7 miles of passageway and they began their descent. And it wasn't that long until 2 of the 10 cavers, the 2 least experienced of the group, said, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. Got a bad feeling about this, but we don't know the way out. And so they needed chaperones to leave. And so 2 other cavers from the group had to go with them. So 4 cavers, they leave Mosdale Caverns. The other 6 are going to continue on. So when the 4 got back to the surface, it was about 5 p.m. They had been in the cavern for several hours at this point. And when they went in, initially, the weather was great. It was beautiful. It was clear. Now they're coming out again, and it had started to rain. Not significantly, it was more like a drizzle, but they were a little bit concerned because they knew the other 6 were planning to be in the cavern until after midnight. So they were just hopeful that the rain did not get any worse. But just a couple of hours later, the skies opened up and it rained like it hadn't rained in years. Just torrential downpour, and the 4 were really concerned about the other 6. So they went back to the entrance hoping that maybe, the other 6 would have heard the rain, although it's very unlikely considering how deep they were going to be. But they were hoping that maybe they'd be coming out again and they would see them and get them back to safety. But when they arrived there, not only were the 6 not out of the cave, but the actual entrance to the cave was completely submerged in water. Earlier that day, when the 4 cavers turned around and left, the other 6 cavers, they continued on, and they had made it about 2 miles deep into these caves. They had passed the fabled Drown or Glory swim, they had survived the knee wrecker passage, and they had bit their tongue as they squeezed through the famously painful Umaguli tunnel. Now located hours away from the only way out. So they are way into this cave. They were nearing the end of this distant section of the cave that they believed on the other end, they would find this hidden entrance into the missing lake. All they had to do was pass through the far marathon section, which is a 900-foot tunnel that is only 10 inches high, 2 feet wide, and you have to wriggle through on your stomach with your face pressed against a stream that runs through it. And it takes a very long time to get through it. It's incredibly claustrophobia inducing. It's considered one of the most stressful things you can do in caving. But considering how experienced these cavers were and the fact that they had come down there specifically to get to this far point in the cave, you gotta figure that their spirits were high. They were probably joking with each other as they're doing this awful thing. And then they made it about 3/4 of the way through this tunnel when someone must have noticed the distant rumbling sound and said, "Hey, what is that?" And as they sat there listening, trying to discern what the sound was, it must have dawned on them that their worst nightmare was about to come true. That was the sound of surging water. This tunnel is about to flood. They began crawling faster and faster down the marathon tunnel. Not only was it very difficult to move quickly inside of this very tight tunnel, but they also knew there was nowhere to go. They're 2 miles underground. They must have felt like the world of sunshine and fresh air was suddenly an eternity away. The oldest of the group was 26, the rest of them were all in their teens. United now by fear, the water came rushing in as they're all pinned inside of the far marathon tunnel, and their face is already up against the river, and now this river is surging with water. And so they're all desperately trying to crawl through this flooding tunnel, and the leader of the group, the guy literally in the front, John Ogden, who was 26, he managed to get all the way through the far marathon tunnel to the space where they anticipated finding that secret entrance into the missing link. That wasn't there, but he found above him there was a small fissure in the rocks. There was an air pocket, and he managed to get his head up into the space right as the water in the far marathon cave completely submerged. So any of the cavers in there, they drowned inside of the far marathon. The bubble that he was in was a little bit bigger, and so some of the cavers managed to get in there, and they tried to clamber into this air pocket as well, but ultimately there was only enough room for one person, and John was the only one up there. And so as the water levels filled the room he was in up to his neck, everyone below John drowned. Now, we don't know if John literally kept other people from getting into this air pocket with him. All we know is it could only hold one person, and ultimately John was the one who was left inside of this crevice. But this air pocket was really just delaying the inevitable because there wasn't very much air inside of it, and John's 2 miles below the surface. There is no way anyone is going to get to him in time. And so he ended up dying a couple days later, and when they found him, he was still in the air pocket trying to get one last breath. What I've not covered in this story that I would encourage you all to check out is there was this incredible effort to try to save these cavers before anyone knew they were deceased. There was this hope that maybe they found an air pocket and they were still alive. And so they basically created this artificial dam that was very precarious. The water could at any moment spill over, and it provided just enough drainage inside of this cavern for some of the best cavers in the world to go into the cavern to look for them. And so they went into this cavern knowing at any minute that makeshift dam on the surface could break and they will 100% drown in here. No one's coming to get them. They had to crawl through the far marathon tunnel all the way down at the bottom to get to the lost cavers. And ultimately, when they discovered they were all deceased, it would have been impossible to remove their bodies. And so the decision was made to leave the 6 cavers where they died and seal off the cave permanently. So in 1967, they sealed it off, and they now treat Mosdale Caverns like a gravesite, and no one goes in it. The next and final story of today's episode is called 10 Years Later. For any diver who can stomach the risks, Bushman's Hole is a world-class diving spot. It's located on a privately owned game farm in South Africa. In the middle of the farm's 11,000 acres sits this massive crater in the ground that from rim to rim is hundreds of feet wide. If you hike down the crater to the middle, there's this little tiny basin of water that almost looks like an oversized puddle. This is the entrance to Bushman's Hole. Once you step into this little puddle and push your way through the very claustrophobia-inducing entrance, you open up into the biggest freshwater cave in the world that goes down to nearly 900 feet. For the people that have been in there, they say it's unbelievable and it's like spacewalking. For young South African Dion, the pull to go to Bushman and explore it was irresistible. Dion had always been a bit of an adrenaline junkie. By the time he was 17, he was racing cars and building motorcycles, and by the time he was 20, he had picked up a new activity, cave diving. Dion had logged about 200 dives before he was invited by a diving group to go to Bushman's Hole and explore it on Christmas break 1994. They were planning a descent to 492 feet, so about the halfway point of the cave, and they needed one more diver, and so Dion was thrilled to go. The dive was going great, but on the way up, as they were making their ascent, the diver ahead of Dion looked back at him, and Dion seemed fine. He gave the hand signal that everything was going great. He had his flashlight out, and then about 30 feet higher in the water, that same diver turned around to check on Dion, and Dion wasn't there anymore. And in fact, this guy saw his flashlight that was still attached to him, basically wavering as it sunk farther and farther down Bushman's Hole. This diver immediately stops the group above him, and he turns around and starts swimming as fast as he can down to try to get to Dion. But Dion was sinking so quickly that this diver realized that it's a suicide mission if I try to go down there. I will either pass out or run out of air. And so deeply saddened, this group of divers had to turn around and leave Dion at the bottom of Bushman's Hole. Although the other divers didn't know for sure, they told Dion's parents that most likely he had suffered from a deep water blackout and then had drowned. When authorities were notified about what happened to Dion, they sent a robot down to the bottom of Bushman's Hole to just locate his body before they sent a person down there. But they never could find his body, they could only ever find his helmet. Dion's parents are devastated. They're never going to see their son again. And since they don't have a body to bury, they decide to go down to Bushman's Hole and put a plaque up next to the entrance to commemorate their son. 10 years later, Dave Shaw, who was a 50-year-old extremely audacious cave diver, was passing the 800-foot mark inside of Bushman's Hole, becoming the third person ever to reach this depth. Shaw touched down on the sloping bottom of the cave. He detached from the cave reel, took out his flashlight, and began swimming around the bottom. As he was scanning around, he looked about 50 feet to his left, and he saw something he immediately recognized. It was a human body. They were on their back with their arms stretched out towards the surface, and when Shaw went over to them, he immediately recognized that this is Dion Dreyer. Ever since Dion died inside of Bushman and had never been recovered, any diver that went in there was keeping their eye out in case they saw him. Shaw examines Dion to see if he's going to be able to be pulled to the surface, if he's solid enough to be pulled to the surface, and he can tell that his hands have skeletonized as well as his skull, although his mask is still placed directly on his skull. But his wetsuit and his tanks had kind of kept the rest of his body pretty tight, which gave him some mass, which meant he'd be able to move him. But as soon as Shaw tried to move him, he couldn't get him to budge because his tanks were caught on something. And so Shaw stayed there for a minute trying to get him free, but he couldn't do it. And that's when Shaw started to think, okay, this is getting irresponsible. I'm going to die down here too if I don't start making my ascent soon. So he ended up tying a line to Dion's body so he could be located again. And then Shaw began the very slow ascent back to the surface. On the way back up, Shaw felt an extreme sense of connection with Dion. He really felt bad for this kid, and all he wanted to do was get him back on land to give back to his family, to give them some closure. And so when he got on the surface, he immediately contacted authorities and said, I'm going to go back down and I'm going to get him. And Shaw also called Dion's parents and told them, I am going to retrieve your son. And his parents were apparently overjoyed. They couldn't believe they were going to get to see their son again. After lots and lots of planning, Shaw's recovery of Dion was scheduled for January 8th, 2005. The dive was going to take 12 hours, and it wasn't just going to be Dave doing the retrieval. It was going to be like a relay race. Dave would be the first one down, and a couple minutes after he entered the water, another diver would go in who would stop about 100 feet above Dave, and then a third diver would go in and stop 100 feet above the second diver, and so on and so forth. Dave would put the body bag over Dion and then carry his body up to the first guy, who would turn around, bring the body up to the next guy, and the next guy to the next guy until Dion was out of the water. At 6:13 in the morning, Shaw entered the water with a camera on his helmet to film the operation. Shortly after he submerged, Dion's parents walked down to the edge of the water to watch. They showed up intentionally late so as not to put added pressure on Shaw. Shaw dropped very quickly to the bottom of Bushman's Hole. He actually arrived about a minute and a half faster than he expected to. As soon as he got down, he shined his light and he found Dion's body. He went over to him, he got the body bag out, and he got to work. 13 minutes after Shaw had submerged, the diver who was slotted above him, that would be the first to receive Dion's body, began looking for signs that Shaw was done and was moving up towards him. But when he looked down, he saw Shaw's flashlight wasn't moving. This diver continued to watch the flashlight very intently to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him, And after a couple of minutes and still no movement, this diver begins going deeper and deeper to try to get a better look at Shaw to see what's going on. And when he got a little bit closer, it became very clear that Shaw was not moving. This diver immediately goes into rescue mode and starts going straight down to get to Shaw to try to help him if he still can. And as he's moving down, he hears this fizzling sound and he looks at his wrist and he can tell that one of his gauges has broken. And this gauge was vital to the dive and it meant he would not be able to get down there. And so with a heavy heart, he had to turn around and go back up. And because of the depth at which they were diving, he could not just go right to the surface and tell everybody what had happened. He needed to stop at various decompression stops along the way. But he had a slate, and on it he wrote in his grease pen, "Dave's not coming back." And he swam the slate up to the next diver who would have received Dion's body, but instead receives this slate. He takes the slate up to the next diver, to the next diver, to the next diver, all the way up to the surface. As soon as this message was read out loud to the group standing around Bushman's Hole, which included Dion's parents, there was 30 seconds of stunned silence. No one could believe this was happening. And then after the silence, Dion's parents are beside themselves. Not only are they not going to see their son probably ever again, but they feel like they are somehow responsible for Shaw's death. Eventually, by the end of the night, all of the other divers that were in the water that day successfully exited the cave and were just fine. As for Shaw, much like Dion, there really wasn't a good way to get him out, and so everyone came to terms with the reality that he was going to be down there with Dion probably forever. The news was so devastating that the team decided to leave all their equipment in place. Eventually, they did need to go down and collect their gear, so everybody goes down to the edge of Bushman's Hole, and before they begin retrieving all of the lines, they sang Amazing Grace in memoriam for the lost diver. Afterwards, they started pulling up the lines, and as they're doing that, they notice all these bubbles coming up from the bottom of the cave. And they looked a little bit closer, and it was Shaw's body and Dion's body. Basically, Shaw had been attached to this line, and he had managed to free Dion before he had passed. And so when they pulled the line, both of them were freed, and they floated to the surface. And so even though Shaw would die doing it, he was able to get Dion out of Bushman's Cave for his family. After the two bodies were taken out, they noticed that the camera on Dave's head was still intact, and it had filmed everything all the way through his final moments. And so they took the tape out and they watched it forward and backwards, slow-mo, frame by frame, and they analyzed it to the point where they understood what happened. When Shaw gets down to Dion, Dion's body that had previously been stuck, and that was the reason Shaw had not been able to free him the first time, somehow he's become unfree and he's now free-floating. And Shaw is having a really hard time trying to control this free-floating body, and his body is literally breaking apart in front of him. As Shaw is trying to wrangle his body, you can hear him start grunting, his breathing is getting elevated, and he's totally losing control of the situation, and the bottom of this cave is slanted, and it's all silty and muddy, and so in the camera you see all this mud and silt getting kicked around, and the visibility is very poor, and after it clears, you see Shaw has gotten completely tangled in some line that's also tangled on Dion, so basically Dion has become his anchor. At this point, Shaw shifts his focus to try to get the lines off of himself, and you can hear his breathing now is becoming much more desperate. It almost sounds like he's gulping for air, and probably at this point, although we don't know for sure, he's suffering from narcosis, which is a condition that divers will run into, where it's like you've drank a whole bunch of alcohol on an empty stomach. It's like you're totally drunk and you're confused, and it's clear that he's becoming a little bit disoriented. And instead of going away from Dion's body to try to go back up and save yourself, instead, he turns and starts fumbling with Dion's midsection, and then he gets out a pair of scissors, but he doesn't use them, he just holds them. Finally, he turns away from Dion because it's clear you're not going to be able to get him out at this point, and with the scissors in hand that he never used, because again, he's probably suffering from narcosis and he's confused, he starts beginning to make his way over to the area where you can go back up. But he starts slowing down, his breathing becomes tragically desperate, and then it becomes silent, and then there's no more movement, and Dave Shaw is dead. 10 days after the bodies were recovered from Bushman's Hole, Dion's parents, although they are absolutely devastated about what happened to Shaw, and they feel very guilty, but at the same time, they're so excited because they get to go to the morgue and see their son again for the first time in 10 years. They don't care what state his body's in. Just the fact that he's actually here, that their actual son is going to be in front of them was just overwhelming for them. And when they went in, they were really fixated on the fact that he had underwear on that they both recognized. Apparently they had bought him a set of jockey underwear and he was wearing jockey underwear. As strange as it is, it was like they got to bond with their child one more time. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please line the floor of the Amazon Music follow button's bedroom with Lego pieces, then set off their fire alarm. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallin.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media